Relapsing remitting, primary progressive, secondary progressive. These are the primary descriptions used to define the various phases of multiple sclerosis. But what would happen if we moved away from such clinical descriptions, instead creating a new system that defines stages according to underlying pathology, rather than how the disease appears clinically? This is the topic we aim to discuss today. I'm Alan Thompson, editor of the MS Journal and host of this episode of the ECTRIMS podcast. A paper published just recently in Lancet Neurology is proposing a new mechanism-driven framework to describe types of MS. The paper has been developed under the auspices of the International Advisory Committee on Clinical Trials in MS, a group jointly sponsored by ECTRIMS and the US National MS Society. This international committee is well known for its work in developing the McDonald diagnostic criteria and the 1996 and 2013 clinical course descriptors for MS. I'm currently the past chair of the committee and am also privileged to be among the co-authors of the paper. I'm joined here today with Tanja Kuhlmann, Associate Professor of Neuropathology at the Institute of Neuropathology at University Hospital Münster in Germany, and the lead author of the paper. Tanja, many thanks for joining us.
Alan, it's great to be here.
Also taking part in today's discussion is Daniel Reich, Senior Investigator in the Translational Neuroradiology section of the National Institute of Health in the USA, and a senior author of the paper. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
So, to begin, Tanja, perhaps you might highlight some of the key points that are made in the paper.
Yeah, I try to do my very best. So accumulating evidence suggests that the clinical course of multiple sclerosis is better considered as a continuum with contributions from concurrent pathophysiological mechanisms that vary across individuals and over time. The apparent evolution to a progressive course reflects a partial shift from a predominantly focal inflammation and acute axonal injury to a more widespread focal and non-focal inflammation and neurodegeneration. And this is associated with failure of compensatory mechanisms such as neuroplasticity and remyelination. Another important factor contributing to progressive disease course is actually aging, and with the aging is associated and a decrease in brain reserve and repair. And the key conclusion of our effort is that progression in MS needs to be viewed more holistically.
Tanja, thanks very much for that. Danny, before we dive into some of the details of the paper, perhaps you could discuss why you feel this work was actually needed.
Yes, well, I think it was quite needed and quite timely. Since the introduction of the Lublin-Reingold clinical course descriptors, first in 1996 and subsequently in 2013, there have been many calls for development of a disease classification that is rooted in the biological mechanisms of MS. We know from work from many people, including you, Alan, that the clinical differences between primary progressive and relapse onset MS are not strongly reflected in biological differences. That is, the data we have suggests that what we previously called phenotypes are not well rooted in the biology. And since treatment and management have to be rooted in biology, we need to rethink our approach. Therefore, the committee decided to examine the current clinical course descriptors more comprehensively, with the goal of determining an approach to developing a new framework for describing the disease. And this paper is our first step in this process.
Thanks, Tanja. Tanja, the paper discusses some of the key disease mechanisms that impact MS progression. Perhaps you could tell us what you think we've learned and what does this actually mean for the framework?
From a pathological point of view, for a quite long time, MS was mostly seen as a disease with two disease phases, a more inflammatory disease phase at the beginning and a more neurodegenerative disease phase later on. However, this was, I think, too simplistic. Now we know that the inflammation persists throughout the whole disease course, and this includes non-resolving inflammation within lesions, but also diffuse inflammation in the non-lesional white matter or in the meninges. And this persistent inflammation drives different neurodegenerative processes, as well as molecular injury mechanisms such as oxidative stress and mitochondrial dysfunction.
Thanks. And following on from this, the paper also highlights the failure of compensatory mechanisms in the CNS and how these failures affect MS progression. Could you say a few more words about this?
Yes, sure. So one compensatory mechanism is remyelination. And remyelination means the formation of a new myelin sheath after a demyelinating event. Unfortunately, the remyelination capacities decrease with age and disease duration. Another compensatory mechanism is brain plasticity. So if there is an injury in the brain and neuronal networks are disturbed or destroyed, a reorganization of these networks occurs and the functions can be restored. However, if there is an accumulation of lesions and persistence of inflammation in the brain, the damage may exceed the capacity of brain plasticity, and this results in failure of compensation.
Many thanks. Danny, another important concept that the paper introduced is the role of biological aging in MS progression. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on this and say why it's so important?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. I might say first that sort of in response to what Tanya just was talking about, I think we may be at a unique moment of convergence between the pathological and the radiological and the clinical data that brings all of these points together and illuminates one another. So I just wanted to mention that as well. But with respect to aging, I would note that by far the strongest predictor of MS progression is simply getting older. And so it's really on us to understand why that's the case. One thing we know for sure is that the body's capacity to respond to injury and fully heal a wound, whether it's a broken bone or a skin ulcer or a focus of inflammatory demyelination in the brain, gets markedly worse as we get older. In the brain, what this means specifically is less remyelination occurs and there's worse recovery from relapse. And while this is an area in which we're learning a lot in the lab about mechanisms, biological mechanisms, we can already identify a number of key concepts, such as the so-called senescence of immune cells and brain cells, which means that the response to injury, for example, damage to DNA, which is occurring all the time, gets more and more limited. And the other thing that occurs with aging is that people accumulate other diseases, in particular metabolic and vascular diseases, which are both very common and can affect the brain. So the interaction between brittle arteries and inflammation-prone veins of multiple sclerosis is probably important for progression as well. And finally, we need to consider hormonal changes that occur in aging. It's been known for a long time that men tend to have more progression in MS at younger ages, but on average, women start to catch up around the time of menopause. And this needs to be understood as well.
Danny, thanks for this. And to your earlier point, I would agree that this bringing together of the different perspectives is both critical and timely. So, Tanya, perhaps you could try and bring this all together for our listeners. Could you give our audience a top-line description of the framework we're proposing in the paper?
Yes. So I think the key message is that we should consider the course of MS as a disease continuum defined by different injury and compensatory mechanisms. And as you and Danny pointed out, we need to develop tools and validate tools that can access these different pathological mechanisms so that we are able to figure out at which time point of which disease mechanism is actually driving disease progression in an individual patient at a certain time point.
Great. Thank you for that. My last question is for both of you. What do you hope this means for people with MS, for the clinicians who treat them, and for the research community? Danny, maybe you take the first crack at this.
Well, that's the key question. And I think the key point is that MS affects the brain and body in many ways. And we urgently need to move toward identifying which of those processes are present in which individual and which are not. And we need to understand which of our treatments are appropriate for each process and where we need to develop entirely new treatments. This has obvious implications for how and in whom we develop our new medications. And it's not lost on us that moving in this direction will be disruptive to the field and potentially confusing to people living with MS and to their providers. but we think it's critical to breaking through the logjam of progressive MS and getting to a place where we can offer treatments that are as impactful as those that now exist for stopping relapses.
Thanks, Tanya. That's a very, very good response to quite a difficult question. Tanya, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, what I would like to add is I think this new framework means that we have to design our research studies differently. For example, if we want to understand how a certain pathology contributes to disease progression, we should stratify the patient cohorts with respect, for example, to fast or slow disease progression and not to the clinical disease course. And I hope for people with MS, it would mean that the framework will help us to develop biomarker-based, biologically informed, successful treatment options for the treatment of progressive MS.
So thank you for that. I mean, do either of you have any thoughts about what the next steps might look like? Because I agree that while we need to move forward and think about how we might change our current course descriptors, we need to do so with care. And any thoughts from either of you? Again, Danny, back to you.
Well, we need to bring together stakeholders from all across the MS world, starting, I think, with people living with MS, but including researchers, including the companies and foundations that are supporting research and developing the medications, the regulatory authorities, and certainly to take into account how MS is playing out in different parts of the world, which can differ, and in people who come from different parts of the world. And we need to get in the same room, which is not always trivial these days, but it's critical for this effort. And to build a blueprint and move forward. And I really hope that this paper provides the framework for how we can do that.
Thanks. And Tanya, do you see this as an international effort, drawing in various countries, or is that going to add complexity to what is already a challenging area?
No, I think definitely we have to do it internationally, and we have to involve, I think, we have to involve the basic researchers, the clinicians, the neuroradiologists, and the patients to solve this next step.
Great. I mean, it's obviously going to be teamwork, and I would say that the production of this paper over the last nearly 18 months has been a great example of how well everybody works together. So let's just hope that that continues, because it will be really important as we move on to the next step. So thank you, Tanya and Danny, and thank you all for listening. You can read more about this topic on the ECTRIMS website, www.ectrims.eu, as well as directly in Lancet Neurology, and also in ECTRIMS' official journal, MSJ, on this and related topics. You can, of course, subscribe to the ECTRIMS podcast on all your favorite podcast channels, and these include Spotify and Apple. And be sure to follow ECTRIMS on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube.